This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is December 2nd, 2021, and this is episode 268.
I'm Scott Delunabo.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, there's more floods in BC, but not floods of information anymore. And we look at Ottawa, where maybe there's a new tenor. Maybe the election was worth it. Maybe. Probably not. We'll get into it. Thank you, everyone who keeps the show going. It's the end of the year. You still have a chance to become a 2021 patron. It's no different than if you're a 2022 patron, but you can claim to be here before all the other people get here next year. Patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's go back to the greatest BC Premier bracket before we get into the content for today. Last time we looked at the top two SoCred premiers, the Bennett duo, the father and the son, W.A.C. Bennett versus Bill Bennett. I didn't know what to do to make this seem like a fair fight. Bill Bennett made the SkyTrain. That was cool. Wacky Bennett built a lot of things. So he won 28-3. W.A.C. Bennett won a lot of elections and was a very formative premier in this province. I probably wouldn't have agreed with a lot of the things he did or the way he did them.
But you don't like hydroelectricity?
I like that. Probably the how he got there. Although I don't think anyone was going to be more respectful of Indigenous sovereignty at that era. It's undeniable he left a legacy in this province, though. Wacky continues on. I expected him to. Let's turn back to the Liberals, but these are the old school Liberals. Our first semifinal, John Oliver versus Boss Johnson. If we turn our minds back, John Oliver was the 19th premier who reigned from 1918 to 1927. A labor history from the online academic community at University of Victoria describes him as the antithesis of Sir Richard McBride. I don't know if it meant in terms of the racism, but it's pretty hard to be as racist as Richard McBride. I think this was focused more on style. John Oliver was not a sir. He was someone with, according to this article, little education, a thick Derbyshire accent, and who came from a simple farming background. When we talked about Oliver in the past, we talked about him as one of the key establishing figures of the small town populist type of premier that Western Canada really loves. He governed for 9 years, which is quite a while in this province, especially in that era. He became premier upon the death of Harlan Brewster. He had served as Minister for Agriculture and Railways in Brewster's cabinet and was nominated and elected by his colleagues to become premier upon Brewster's death. One of the first things he did, I think it may have been when he was still a minister, but he passed the Land Settlement and Development Act for returning World War I soldiers. And the idea of this bill was to give soldiers parcels of land across BC so they could set up homesteads and farms, because the economy had been radically redone during the war. Women had been allowed into the workforce. Some initial labor laws had been put in place, so things were changing quite significantly, and there wasn't necessarily all the same jobs for people, but he wanted to make sure people had somewhere to go. That didn't work, though, as most soldiers went to the cities. This, along with everything else that was happening at the time, led to increasing labor challenges with a growing number of strikes in 1918 and eventually a general strike in 1919. Some of these were precipitated by the death of Ginger Goodwin, the famous socialist leader who was killed by the RCMP, who we should talk about someday on the podcast. So Oliver was a liberal who, when we talked about last time, passed a lot of social reforms in his early days, then faced some budgetary challenges and scaled back in the middle of his term, and then towards the end turned back to the social legislation that had made him quite popular, or at least he felt proud of, it seems like. He did face challenges in election of 1920, but he managed to pitch enough of a positive agenda that he could earn some of the Labour vote that was quite mad at him, and managed to take 26 seats to the Conservatives' 14. Labour held on to 4, and 3 independents were elected. Things around this period were things like the mother's pension, expanding health and social services. Jumping ahead towards the end, the thing he says he's most proud of was bringing an old age pension in 1927, right before he passed away. By 1926, he was actually the oldest government leader in Canada at age 70. He fell ill later that year and went to the Mayo Clinic in America in May of 1927. He did return to BC, and he actually went to his caucus and said tearfully, "I'm too sick, I need to resign, please let me go." And they urged him to stay on, I guess to his detriment, because he died in Victoria 1 year later at age 71. He was so popular, though, by this point, revered in many ways, that he was given an official state funeral, and one of the few people really venerated on their death in BC history. The Canadian Encyclopedia ends by saying he was a populist leader. He had strengthened and consolidated the provincial Liberal Party and established a folksy yet combative style of leadership that would be emulated by British Columbia premiers for generations to come. So that John Oliver, maybe not as witty or full of banter as the one you're more familiar with from Last Week Tonight. I wasn't alive at the time. Maybe he was the John Oliver of his day. Pitted against him is the other Liberal from the era we're looking at, Boss Johnson. This is the lacrosse player turned premier. I'm sure John Horgan would have a soft spot for Boss Johnson. He was the 24th premier from December 1947 to August 1952. He was born and raised in Victoria, serving in World War I. He was actually the first premier of BC who was born in BC after BC joined Confederation, if that makes sense. So he was, I think we'd had people who were born in these territories or these lands, but it wasn't after Confederation. I don't know if that's a distinction worth drawing up. After he served in World War I, he opened a supply business with his family. He got involved in politics in 1933, being elected as a Liberal and serving in the cabinet of Duff Patello before being defeated in 1937. During World War II, he was put in charge of building our Royal Canadian Air Force facilities across BC. I think in the way that Seth Klein, for those who listened to that interview, described the industry leaders being taken on by government to help nationalize and build a bunch of war facilities. He went back to politics in 1945, joining the cabinet government of the coalition government of John Hart, and he would succeed Hart to be the next leader of the Liberal Party and lead that conservative Liberal coalition. He introduced compulsory health insurance in BC and the 3% PST to pay for that. So if you like our health insurance system, he's the one who started that. He expanded highways, extended the Great Pacific Great Eastern Railway. He facilitated construction of the Kenny Dam, which one article describes as the first major hydroelectric project in BC, but others have said it's other things. He was one of the first of the building premiers in the way that W.A.C. Bennett built a lot of things. Ironically, today, Boss Johnson also had to deal with devastating floods in the Fraser Valley. His were in 1948, and he did declare a state of emergency. It doesn't say how long it took him, though, so we can't judge him on that. We might have to look into that if he proceeds.
I'm going to guess it's probably less than 5 days. Feel like the level of basic competence you'd expect from a government.
Communication was slower at the time, and if you're in Victoria, you may not have known what was happening.
I feel like they had a telegraph line at that point.
He also started building the dikes of the Fraser River, which persist to today, but have been disappointingly neglected, it turns out, among the many things that needed updates. But it turns out that was the one, in hindsight, we should have been updating, but we'll get into that. Boss Johnson also appointed Nancy Hodge as the second female speaker in the entire Commonwealth, the first being also from BC, I think about a decade earlier. He also disbanded the BC Provincial Police and brought in the RCMP, which I guess saved the province money, but people debate, or I would debate, whether that was a good idea at this point. In 1949, he led the party and the coalition to a massive victory. I think between the Conservatives and Liberals, they took 60 or more % of the vote. Though a couple years later, in 1951, the Conservatives withdrew their support from that coalition. Ultimately, their party did not do well by that decision, as they were all defeated in 1952 when the Socreds came to power. Johnson would die in 1964. So, two interesting premiers. I don't know who I think is the greater premier, unlike many of these rounds. John Oliver versus Boss Johnson from another era. Go to our Twitter at PoliticosPod to vote. Hopefully I'll remember to put it up on our website, politicos.ca/bracket. Go vote. Choose who the greatest premier of these two were. Let's jump into our first main segment, Lost in the Flood. The parade of storms is over. We had a nice sunny today here in the Lower Mainland. I managed to get into Vancouver and it was gorgeous. Nice blue sky on the SkyTrain. But all earlier in the week, it was raining and then raining a little less and then raining a lot more. And thankfully, things didn't go as bad. There were still a couple mudslides, I think, on some of the major routes, but nothing as devastating to the province. Like the waters rose in Abbotsford again, but they didn't. Worst case scenarios weren't hit this week, as far as...
Yeah, the Sumas dikes, I believe, held this time, and overall less damaging, but still, nevertheless, not great for Abbotsford and the Valley, nor for other parts of the province that, it's, like you said, experienced landslides. And there's definitely concern, I think, because the interior got pretty warm today, so there's could potentially be more meltwater entering the system. So we may not be out of the woods yet.
Yeah, it was wild. I saw we were breaking December temperature records in multiple places in the interior. Like Penticton hit 22 the other day, which is quite warm for December, let alone just anytime. That would be a nice day in the summer, a bit cool, but yeah, it's hot if it's 22 in December in the interior. Climate change is a hell of a thing. We're also getting a bit of a sense of what the cleanup will take, what the restoration will take. It seems like things will be not quick. The Coquihalla is going to be months. Highway 1, I don't even know what they're doing. I saw a picture where the temporary train line was just cutting through where the highway used to be.
Yeah, up in the Fraser Canyon there.
We've just given up on the highway. We're like, screw it. The train's the only thing that can get through at this point.
Well, there's fewer train routes than highway routes, so I guess that takes priority.
I think trains are also easier to put down, train tracks. So just wild what has happened in this province. Some of the pipelines are starting to get back up. Trans Mountain is starting to get close to being back up. I don't think it's ready yet. Our state of emergency is extended.
Early next week is what they're saying at the moment.
And that'll help return gasoline to the many pumps across the Lower Mainland and island where drivers are still facing fuel rations, at least internal combustion engine drivers.
Well, the government did extend the fuel rationing until December 14th.
Well, so let's get into the main political story that came up this week. And this is, reported by Tyler Olson and others from a press release from the Fraser Valley Regional District. But this is quite the alarming news conference with Jason Lum, the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District, basically saying the province didn't answer the phone for a week, and that meant the Othello Road got washed out and many things that could have been prevented weren't.
Yeah, according to Mr. Lum, they issued an urgent request to Emergency Management BC on November 24th for funds to help secure the Othello Road and surrounding areas related to rising waters from the Coquihalla River. Turns out nobody could be bothered to answer the phone or reply to the emails or give any indication that they were in fact communicating with the areas that were most severely affected by this. And this is important because, well, the current system relies on local governments to be the front end of the spear on this one and do a lot of the actual work on emergency responses. The funding comes from the province on this, and that funding needs to be able to be there so they can actually get the resources moving to respond to it. So it's a big deal that the province didn't come through on this, and only didn't come through, but couldn't even manage the basics of acknowledging the response, which is just unconscionably incompetent by the government.
So that's a story from Lum in the Fraser Valley Regional District. When asked about this, Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth initially denied that they had received the request. He said it hadn't reached his office, and I think he even made it broadly as we didn't receive the request. Emergency Management BC didn't even receive the request, so it was unclear on that part. And he went on to add that local authorities don't actually need approval of expenditures by the province before taking response actions, though he clarified that, quote, they are advised to obtain authorization of financial assistance to check assumptions about which response costs the province considers eligible for financial assistance, especially when dealing with large cost items, which I think is why this was going to be a phone call. Just like we're not submitting a full grant request to cover off expenditures, but just calling in to check like, hey, we're going to spend a bunch of money to save a road. Is that okay?
Yeah, and this notably came after, actually, I'm not sure if it's after, but notably, one of the response requests that they put in was for $30,000 to help pay for the firefighters they deployed as part of this, that the province rejected, leaving the Fraser Valley in a pretty awkward position on. Now, Farnworth has said that's under review, but that's clearly a problem if they're not approving this stuff and then taking a while and basically putting the local governments in a position where they aren't necessarily able to rely on this stuff on a good faith assumption that what they'll be deploying is actually available. Nor is it clear that they necessarily have large cash reserves they can tap into immediately anyway.
Yeah, Lum said in a separate statement that the districts don't have discretionary spending accounts. Like, they don't have pools of money like the province essentially does to just spend tens of thousands or more.
Or 1.5 million.
As it's needed. Or, yeah, millions. Maybe they could have covered 30,000, but yeah, 1.5 million is a lot. It's a mess. It's definitely bad. It's like you say, it's incompetence, and it's frustrating that it happens like this, that it comes out like this.
Not only that, I think you can't look at this and not contrast it to what the government was actually signaling by their actions as the thing they were most concerned about in the past week. And that clearly wasn't the situation in the Fraser Valley, because they couldn't be bothered to answer the phone on that. But instead, they were pushing hard to get the FOI bill through, both using all the legislative tools they had to push it through as quickly as possible through the ledge, but also then turning around despite multiple assurances that there was going to be a process for setting the fees that they were going to do, and instead just within hours of the bill passing and receiving royal assent, issuing order in council setting the fee at $10. So, like, clearly from how this government acted, the NDP's primary concern in the last week was not keeping the Othello Road from washing out or helping the people in the Fraser Valley. It was making sure that John Horgan didn't get bothered by someone FOIing what was on his phone.
So, I think the fee is bullshit. I think it's an affront to democracy and open government, and we've gone over why it's garbage. I also think that's an unfair argument that you're making here. Like, the legislature finished last week, so they had to if they were going to pass the legislation, they were going to pass it last week. Now, I think we both agree they shouldn't have passed the legislation,
or
but it was clear they were going to. In that case, they're sitting in government, or they're sitting in Victoria. The Fraser Valley is flooding and debating the bill anyway. At least this way, they're in their offices not answering the phone instead of in the chamber not answering the phone. I think they're separate issues. As to the order in council setting the fee, that's something that's written almost pro forma and enacted in course. It's how government generally works on these kind of bills. It's annoying and it sucks. And yeah, the timing is awful, especially because it looks like they're trying to cover up, or it can look like they're trying to use it to cover up the response to this.
Not only that, but
although I should note that you can still file an FOI, it just costs $10, which is just annoying.
Yeah, well, but not only that, there's also the fact that the minister responsible for this pretty clearly misled the House when she said that no decision had been made and there's going to be a process involved in setting the fees. So it's problematic there. Also, the House...
I mean, that's a borderline defamatory argument you have no evidence for. Like, she said that it might be $25, and
well, I'm going off reporting.
We don't know.
I'm going off reporting by Rob Shaw about what was said in the House this week on that. So statements made by the minister in the House related to the process.
So she said there would be a process, but process doesn't necessarily mean anything more than just we talked in cabinet and decided.
It was pretty...
You said they set a fee. We don't have any proof they did. They pitched 25. They said maybe nothing.
It was more
maybe they're wildly...
It was pretty clear that the implication of what was said was that there was going to be an actual process of engaging British Columbians on this, and that was not what happened there. But I'll leave it to the opposition to litigate that one further. I will also point out that during all these legislative shenanigans, or whatever you want to call it as, the public safety minister was also the House leader. So I don't think you can entirely divorce the two situations either. And, okay, I think everyone's in agreement the Emergency Program Act needs some updating, and things aren't perfect there. But granting that, there's pretty clearly some things that this government should have seen coming after they bundled the last emergency pretty badly, and they didn't get around to fixing then. But if it's the case where we're now a couple weeks into the situation and things are not working and there's not those funds easily flowing out the doors because of the existing legal process isn't well suited to that, then maybe they should have put forward some emergency legislation rather than ramming through the bills. At some point, though, you just have to circle back to the fact that when governments really care about something, they will move heaven and earth to get that done. And when they don't, they make excuses about process, and that's what they've done here.
I would say I'm at least glad they haven't rushed emergency management legislation through. More needs to have been done in the past, and more prep, and the handling has not been great again. But among the kinds of legislation that I don't want to see rushed, particularly given how rarely it gets dealt with, like, as far as I understand it, an entire review had been planned, and that review hasn't been done. So if the review hasn't been done or completed, you really can't bring legislation forward.
What I'm saying here is not do the entire overhaul during the ongoing emergency, but if there's key deficiencies that are identified during the situation where the legislation is, as written, is preventing creating barriers right now to actual action, you could put in some temporary legislation with a sunset provision that clears those barriers out of the way, whether that is just a grant of changing some of the funding rules for the duration of this, whatever the process is on that. It could be done where if they needed to make some tweaks to the program in response to the immediate stuff, they can do that and then circle back to the formal review and updating of the legislation at a later date. The broader...
Honestly, I suspect most people who are in the ministry who would have to identify the problems are neck deep in the problems that they can't...
Are they, though? They're not picking up the phone, so...
Maybe there just aren't enough people there.
Okay.
And in that case, it's really hard to manage.
But the government has thousands of employees. If they needed to, they can task someone on a temporary basis to Emergency Management BC to help fill some of the staffing deficiencies there. But there really is no excuse for this big a screw-up on their part where they left things to just hang unresponded to for this long.
I'm hopeful we get... Hey, let's do this. Let's settle on this. Let's plan our COVID inquiry that needs to happen and should happen at every level to make sure we know what went right and what went wrong on that. both here in BC, federally, every province. Let's add now the flood response inquiry to that. We'll have the
heat dome
inquiry that could be tied in just to how do we respond to disasters inquiry. And we'll have the money laundering inquiry, which is not reporting at the end of this year. It has been extended, but we'll get the answers on money laundering as well. So public inquiries nonstop. Let's get to the bottom of this. And hopefully not much more happens in the meantime while we're trying to figure out what went wrong.
Which is apparently a lot. Yeah, no, ministers in the past have resigned over less than this. Hopefully there's some accountability on this, because it is clearly needed, and emergency management is one of those things that often doesn't get the attention it deserves when it's not a pressing issue, which makes it all the more important that when something like this does happen and there are serious mistakes made, that there is some pretty serious accountability there.
Well, and I don't want to slag them entirely, because I know there has been a lot of stuff going on at emergency management and in the public safety portfolio in terms of like seismic upgrading at schools, which is one of those things that no one thinks about until you have the worst case scenario of a bunch of dead children laying around. And that would be bad if we hadn't done it. But if you do it and then there's no earthquake, you get no credit for it, but it was still the right thing to do. And obviously we were behind on the dikes maintenance, and that's a big issue. But there's not much we could have done in the last 12 months to catch up on that. We should get started on that work. We should have gotten started on that work, it turns out. But it is a massive project based on some of the reports that have come out. And I guess that just emphasizes the need to, triple our budget on climate resiliency. That's those sections of Clean BC we all gloss over because we're like not wanting to think about how bad climate change is going to get for the province. But some of it is in there and needs to get more money, turns out. It's expensive to maintain, not just maintain, but also upgrade the infrastructure we have to withstand more devastating situations. So fun times here in BC. Let's pivot to Ottawa, where things are far less heated, it seems. Weirdly, Scott, was this election worth it if it turns out that it gave like Aaron O'Toole the strength to control the loons in his caucus and like Parliament can come together unanimously and pass a conversion therapy bill in a day? Or at least the House.
Probably not worth it just on that alone.
Let's talk about what happened.
Yeah, I think this caught a lot of people by surprise. So I believe we mentioned last week that one of the legislation pieces that were going to be coming forward by the Liberals was a renewed attempt to ban conversion therapy. Third time apparently being the charm. This is being a bill that has previously caused some bozo eruptions among the Conservatives. And they have apparently, much to everyone's surprise, learned their lesson on that. And a Conservative member actually moved for the bill to proceed with unanimous consent of the House, which it did.
Yeah. Justice critic Rob Moore, New Brunswick MP, moved the motion. Big ups for him. It sounds like this was very pre-planned from the Conservative caucus meetings as a strategy. It lets the bill, if a bill has unanimous consent, it doesn't need to go through the readings. It doesn't need to go through committee. It just goes to the other house. So it's off to the Senate already. And I'm divided. I would love to see it pass, but this bill is actually different. Like the language in it is substantively different than previous iterations. It's, for example, the bill that was introduced late last year, it differentiated between minors and adults. It said anyone who tries to do conversion therapy on a minor is guilty of the offense, but only people who do it on an adult without their consent are guilty. This one is just, if you do conversion therapy, you are guilty. You go to jail. That kind of language, I'm in favor of that stronger bill, but that's the kind of stuff that should probably get reviewed by a committee in at least one of the houses, less Parliament roll over on the job on legislative scrutiny.
Yeah, that last part does. I'm not going to pretend I know the constitutionality and the finer points of law there, but at least I could see a plausible case where that may get into some constitutionally tougher ground on that, and it's worth the scrutiny on that.
At least even so that there can be like a legislative record that the court can turn to interpret the purpose of it. That's the kind of stuff that happens. So it's off to the Senate, though. Hopefully they give it a good look over. Maybe there is deficiencies in it still. But yeah, it goes through. On the conservative strategy side, this is super fascinating, though, right? Because you have...
That's way more interesting than the bill itself, is the fact, at least from a political standpoint, is the fact that this apparently indicates that Erin O'Toole's managed to gain control of a somewhat unruly caucus and enact a strategy that the more conservative members who were, I think, the people who were least in favor of some of the leadership decisions he's made are at the point where they feel the need to fall in line or back him on this, which is definitely a change from what we were talking about a month ago with his caucus.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, like, several of the Conservative MPs who voted against the previous bills are still in Parliament. Some were defeated, but some other social conservatives, like Leslyn Lewis, are in Ottawa now, or in Parliament. So there are definitely MPs who I would have expected to voice their opposition to this bill, who had the opportunity to voice their opposition, but did not. Now, they didn't vote. They weren't required to do a roll call vote in favor of the bill, because the speaker just asked, does anyone oppose? Hearing none, it moves forward unanimously, which is how I like to conduct meetings, because if no one opposes, why are you voting? But it's good for Erin O'Toole. It's actually bad for Justin Trudeau. Like, I'm sure he was hoping to draw out those
for sure
bozo eruptions again. So they've taken that tool away. It's also good for Justin Trudeau because he wants to claim this as a win. But it's just fascinating.
Yeah, but he gets to claim it as a win without a contrast with the other parties, which is not quite as good as a win with a contrast.
There was another motion for unanimous consent that I think we'll get to at the end of the show if we have time, but that one did not go through. Instead, the Conservatives sang "Oh Canada" to it.
Oh, is this the Quebec, the block one?
Yeah, we'll come back to that. The Liberals introduced a couple other bills that are slowly moving forward. The COVID the COVID spending updates is in there, but I want to talk about Bill C3, which is the Act to amend the Criminal Code and the Canada Labour Code. This bill does two things. It introduces 10 paid sick days for federally regulated employees, a big promise by Trudeau, and it bans protests at hospitals, another promise by Trudeau, but it does them in the same bill.
Omnibus legislation.
No, they don't do omnibus bills. I've been told.
So bills that are omnibus, but not omnibus bills.
So what gets me here is this. So we talked in depth a bit about the BC bill that's now law to ban protests or to prohibit protests outside hospitals, schools, and COVID clinics. I think I came to the position that's a reasonable enough one. Like, we have restrictions on harassing people. We have restrictions on threats. We should be careful about restricting the right to protest, is my general position. This and the BC bill has some limits and sunsets itself. So hopefully it won't go too far. This federal one says everyone commits an offense if you impede someone from obtaining health services, if you do any conduct with the intent to provoke a state of fear in a health professional or a person who assists a health professional. And the intent to provoke a state of fear is a weird phrase for me. You also commit offense if you intentionally obstruct or interfere with another person's lawful access to health services. And what's most notable is this section goes right after the intimidation section of the criminal code, where it's already a crime to intimidate people with a penalty of up to 5 years in jail. This one comes with a penalty of up to 10 years in jail, which is a lot. Like, I don't like COVID hospital protesters, but I also don't think we need to put them in jail for 10 years.
It does seem a little disproportionate. I think there are absolutely crimes where 10 years seems reasonable, but this?
Like, I know it's a maximum in the legislation, but it is a strong one. There's no sunset clause in here as well. So it'll just be a permanent criminal code offense as opposed to BC's law, which is just like a parking fine, kind of, because BC doesn't run a criminal code. We just give tickets for things. So yeah, that's that. And the one thing you have to remember is if you have concerns about that, you want to slow this bill down, you are also denying people their 10 paid sick days because the Liberals put them together. I hate it. I hate it, Scott. I really want good legislative scrutiny on the first half, and I just want the 10 days to sail through.
I'm a little more fine with scrutiny on both, but the legislative shenanigans going on here, yeah, I could do without.
Yeah, because they're separate questions, right? They're separate issues that deserve, like...
Yeah, and like...
When it goes to committee, you want different witnesses to talk to those two things.
Yeah, and sit days are something with that has a cost attached to it, and anytime there is that, there should be some scrutiny applied. So, yeah, it would be nice if you dropped that.
Another bill, so the Senate has also introduced a bevy of bills. There's, I think, two or three government bills in the Senate. I don't really want to talk about them. There's some, what did I say, like 20 or 30 private members bills in the Senate right now. No Kindness Day level stuff yet, but I want to talk about the pro forma bill, Senate Bill S1, because this is something that I think we both learned about today.
Yeah, so as I think most of our listeners probably know, because we've mentioned it a few times in the past, and there are also quite a few are just parliamentary nerds. Typically, the first bill is a bill about the supremacy of Parliament. That's a pro forma bill, basically saying, yeah, Parliament can do what it wants, regardless of what the Queen thinks. Basically, asserting its own powers and purviews. Interestingly enough, Bill S1 in the Senate is not titled an act regarding parliamentary supremacy or an act respecting the Senate or anything like that. So, what is it called?
It's an act respecting to railways.
Relating to railways.
It's an act relating to railways.
Which is interesting. Not what I was expecting.
So the Senate put out on their news piece on November 23rd when the bill was introduced, the answer, why is it called an act relating to railways? And they say the answer to that question lies in history. It dates back to Confederation. When the Senate was created, it was to represent each region. It was to give regional voices in Parliament. And you can argue that it does that still or that it doesn't based on how much you think the Maritimes, and in particular, deserve extra voices. But the regions have voices. One of the big things, the biggest thing, arguably, towards unification of Canada at the time was the construction of the Transcontinental Canadian Pacific Railway, which was underway.
So fact, as we talked about in the first section, it's still important.
So they introduced an act respecting railways, an act relating to railways, as a way to say, we want the right to talk about trains with or without the monarch's permission. And I am generally a Senate abolitionist, but this is cute. I know there's a dark colonial side to the history of the railway in this country, but I'm choosing to just ignore that for a second, to just pretend senators just are like model train enthusiasts. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a great bit of trivia.
Also, the Senate is currently meeting in the Senate is currently meeting in Ottawa's old central train station that was built in 1912 as the House of Commons and Parliament is under renovations. So it's all fitting. That's the legislation, though. Other stuff is happening as compromises are being reached on the other hot topic issues of the last Parliament. They were fighting over conversion therapy, and now they were fighting over China. But now it seems like,
well, more specifically, the Winnipeg labs. So
yeah, I guess they haven't reached a compromise on China, but at least on the lab documents.
or the Liberals have offered compromise. So, as people may remember, during the last Parliament before the election, there was concern by the opposition parties over what happened at Canada's primary microbiology lab in Winnipeg, related to the firing of a couple scientists that worked there with ties to China. The Trudeau government refused to release the documents, originally citing privacy, and then later switching the rationale to national security. Parliament demanded the documents anyway, got to the point where Parliament declared the government in contempt for not releasing the documents. Then the Liberals took the rather unprecedented step of suing the Speaker over the decision to declare the Liberals in contempt and demand the documents anyway. That all got muted out when the legislature, or when Parliament, was dissolved for the election. The court case was dismissed as it wasn't a current live case or controversy there because there was no Parliament during the election period. And now they've come back. As we've mentioned, the Parliament is pretty much the same Parliament that left, and the opposition is just as interested as they were before in finding out what happened there. So one of their early demands in this new Parliament was to hand over the documents.
And so the Liberals have now offered a deal to end the standoff, offered a compromise, which is always when the government offers to reach a deal with those who have a constitutional right to certain information. I'm a little suspect of the deal itself, but I couldn't actually read the Globe and Mail story because of the paywall. What's in the deal, Scott?
So basically, they are proposing to follow the precedent that was established around the Afghan detainees issue back around, I want to say 2010, 2011. There were basically a ad hoc committee would be struck by Parliament. The members would be from all the political parties, and they would be vetted ahead of time for security clearance reasons. It was 2010. And then they would review the documents and decide what can be released or what stays undisclosed for national security reasons.
I guess we're setting a precedent if this is the way we go forward. It's not the worst precedent. At least parliamentarians are getting to, and opposition members are getting an opportunity to review the documents. I get that, I get the idea that certain documents may have national security implications. That means that putting them in MPs' hands in a committee forum where they would generally be public. Our committees don't operate in secret at the federal level, unlike the municipal level. Municipal levels do a lot of in-camera meetings. But the federal government's committees, Parliament's committees, are open, right? It's a core tenet of our democracy. And so having some way to try to balance that, maybe it's reasonable.
Now, what do you think of it? If we've now basically done it twice in 10 years or so, it may be worth thinking about, rather than doing this kind of on an ad hoc basis, setting something up a little more permanent for this role. But still, yeah, it seems like a reasonable-ish approach on that. I'm admittedly a little more suspect than I normally would be on the national security stuff, just because the Liberals originally did not say there was a security issue there. It was a privacy issue.
I guess the nice thing about Parliament is that it's supreme and therefore could agree to this, and then MPs, given that the opposition has a majority, could always change the rules again and pass a different motion down the road. There's some parliamentary procedure thing where you're not supposed to do the same motion twice in a sitting, but I'm sure there's a way they could work around it. They could agree to this and then change their minds.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.
So, as of the Globe and Mail piece going out, none of the opposition parties had a chance to review the motion or the proposal yet. We don't know whether or not this will be agreed to, but probably a good thing that this is not going back to the courts over that rather dumb lawsuit that the Liberals launched.
So we'll have to see where that goes. It's not the only controversy in the House at the moment, though. The Conservatives also raised a question of privilege, as they promised to do very early in the sitting, with my parents' MP, Blake Richards, for Airdrie, Cochrane, whatever, just outside Calgary, raising a question of whether the Board of Internal Economy's decision to prohibit people who haven't been vaccinated from entering the chamber was permissible, or whether it violated the privilege of the members. House Speaker Anthony Rota ruled on that today, siding with the Conservatives. He ruled it out of order, but he did acknowledge that there is a question of privilege at play. So he said the board's decision to restrict access to the precinct only to those who are fully vaccinated or who have a valid medical exemption, including members, has the effect of putting conditions on members' participation in the proceedings of the House. He ruled it moot because the Liberals and NDP had passed a hybrid motion, or had passed a motion to enable hybrid sittings again. And so unvaccinated MPs can still participate. He did encourage the Conservatives that, like, if you really have a problem, you need to frame a better motion and come back. And they seem like they're not going to do that, which also suggests that O'Toole has managed to let enough pressure off that tap, maybe.
Yeah, also, I think it was a reasonable critique of the process that was used here, and MPs in general take to the parliamentary privileges pretty seriously, and I think Conservatives probably more so than other people, than other parties on that stuff.
Now that they're in opposition. Opposition MPs take it more seriously than government MPs, let's say.
Yeah, in general, but there is also... We
literally just talked about the contempt of parliament motions from Harper Hira.
True, but just in the kind of general intellectual firmament of the various parties, it is something that I think Conservatives do place a higher value or place more emphasis on, necessarily than perhaps New Democrats or Liberals do. But
at least more than the Bloc.
Yeah, that's a bit of a low bar there. But yeah, we talked about this back when it was first discussed shortly after the election, and at the time I said is that, yeah, you want a vaccine mandate, but there are serious questions of privilege here on it that's worth diving into, even if you like the ultimate outcome, and I'm glad they at least raised that and have a ruling that supports that, even if the actual outcome did not change, which I'm also happy for.
Yeah, we've seen the question raised at different levels of government as well. I know, like, the city of Vancouver, for example, implemented a vaccine mandate for staff, but didn't do it for council, even though every council member declared that they had been vaccinated. So they went like, it's not necessary and it raises constitutional questions we don't want to deal with, so we won't deal with it. Other councils, I'm not sure exactly what they've done. I think the BC legislature actually did formally require it for MLAs, but it was a situation where everyone had been vaccinated. As far as we can tell, everyone in Parliament has been vaccinated or has declared an exemption, which the exemption numbers are disproportionately higher in the Conservative caucus, let's say, from what I've seen reported. But at least for Erin O'Toole, that seems to be a fight that's drifting into memory versus one that is threatening to blow up his party, as it was when the Civil Liberties Caucus was announced.
Yeah, so at the very least, between this and the story we started out the segment with, he seems to have gotten through the troubled waters and put the most divisive stuff within the party behind him. There's, I think, still some stuff to sort out for sure, but in terms of having his hand forced to make a decision on this stuff or come down a certain way or not, the most controversial stuff seems to have passed, which probably bodes well for or bodes at least a bit better for his leadership prospects going forward.
Yeah, it's definitely untenable if you have a divided membership and divided caucus. You should at least have but let's remember that I don't think anyone in the NDP caucus was out for Mulcair's head the day after the election, but the membership still murdered him, metaphorically, at the convention. So there's still a lot to happen for Mulcair, and now that he's got caucus under control, he needs to somehow bring the Conservative membership along and give them a bit of a focus on why he should keep his job. And hey, maybe the best chance for that is when the fiscal update is brought in a couple weeks on December 14th.
Yeah, so it was announced today that Mr. Freeland will be tabling the fiscal update then. I don't really have much to say on it.
Yeah, there's nothing to say. It's going to come on.
We'll keep an eye out for it. There may be there'll be stuff to watch for sure, but nothing to really discuss at this moment.
Well, let's jump into quick takes, just a few more stories to round off the show. First up, a group of teenagers is setting up to launch a court challenge for the voting age in Canada. These are people in Nova Scotia who are challenging the idea that you can't vote until you're 18. 13 people across the country, actually. Sorry. This is a group of people from across the country, 13, ranging in age from 12 to 18, with some from, Nova Scotia to across, who are arguing you should be able to vote if you're under 18 because especially the climate change effects that will affect these young people in the future, they should have a say in. Their application has been filed in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. This is not the first time young people have tried to change the voting law in Canada. There was a case in Alberta about a decade ago, and it made it to the Court of Appeal where it didn't get a deep hearing. It got dismissed in a very short ruling. But at the lower court, they basically came to the conclusion that yes, Section 3 is very important and your voting rights are very important and they're a charter issue, and a voting age does violate your Section 3 rights, but it's reasonable to have some age, and 18 seems reasonable enough. So under Section 1, it's saved, and Parliament could change it if it wants. And that's where they came down.
It's probably likely that this court challenge will end the same way, and yeah, 18 is entirely reasonable on that, and there does need to be a cutoff between adulthood and childhood, and we've more or less settled on 18 being that age, and there isn't really a strong case to alter that particularly.
So I'll make the case quickly before we move on, because we can have this debate in more depth. The Charter itself in Section 3 is every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election. Every citizen of Canada, not every adult citizen. It just says every citizen. And the reason I would say that the court might take, especially the Supreme Court of Canada, might take an expansive look at this is its recent decision in Frank v. Canada, where it looked at overseas and expat voters. And it basically said Canada previously had a rule limiting you to voting overseas for up to 5 years abroad. And the Supreme Court decided, I think it was a narrow majority, but it decided that that's not reasonable. The Charter is pretty clear that you have that right to vote if you're a citizen. And if they wanted limits on that, it's such a core right. It's one of the deepest rights in the Charter. You can't, notwithstanding, clause it out, that it should be interpreted broadly. And because they said it should be interpreted broadly, I could see the court being more sympathetic now than they were the last round.
I still think that's a bit of a stretch. Being a citizen not residing in Canada is just different than being a child.
But it literally doesn't say child can't vote.
No, but there's established precedent, that's what it means. And it seems rather obvious that when that section was being written, nobody intended that a 1-year-old would be able to vote. So there's clearly an implicit understanding in there that it is not universal to everyone regardless of age.
It was implicitly understood that it wasn't universal to women or people of color or indigenous folks, and that's changed over time. So
well, this
I'm
was
curious
1982.
to see where this.
Those were
I'm
not the
curious to
understandings
see
then.
where this goes. Let's talk about the fun vote, though. The fun vote was at the BC College of Chiropractors AGM. They had a vote, and they mostly agreed on a thing. In fact, 78% agreed that the college needs to, quote, take a stand against COVID-19 vaccine mandates.
Just the worst.
So this is great reporting from CBC reporter Bethany Lindsay, who brings her A game to most reporting she does, but she really has a good beat on like pseudoscience in health regulations in BC. And she's done a series of stories on chiropractor malpractice effectively and other stuff like that. But this one has a bit of a political angle because here you have the self-regulatory body for chiropractors in BC, the College of Chiropractors, their memberships, at least those who show up at the AGM, making a clear sign and stance that I'm not going to say they're all anti-science, but they took one where the leading proponents of this motion, as Bethany Lindsay reports, argued that the vaccine science around the COVID-19 vaccine isn't settled. We don't know if it's effective. We don't know if it's safe. A bunch of stuff that's just discredited nonsense. And 78% voted in favor of that motion. It's non-binding on the board of chiropractors, but it does really highlight the issues with health regulation profession, with the regulation of health professions in this province, something that's been in review for a number of years. And I know Sonia Furstenau and the BC Greens have a lot of strong opinions on, and things are moving towards a better system. I know they're planning to amalgamate a number of the colleges, and the College of Chiropractors and the College of Naturopaths will stop existing then. They'll just get in the other category, so they might still be recognized. But these are the bodies that exist to ensure our health professionals are acting in your best interest and using the best available evidence. And I don't think either of those are at play when they're voting like this.
No, I'm not surprised. Of the various organizations I could see taking such a stance, I am not surprised that this one in particular is on that list. But it just in general, it's been disappointing to see how many of the various organizations have taken hesitant stances towards vaccine requirements in one way or another. Just across everything. Although not everywhere. I'm just coming across this story as we're looking here. Apparently, there is the German Euthanasia Association is requiring COVID vaccines for all of the people they are providing services to, which is taking things pretty far in the other direction to a slightly amusing degree.
Jesus, that's dark.
You see, like of everything where you'd want to make sure someone's vaccinated, that seems to be probably the lowest priority, but
I have to assume that includes like the family members who are there.
Yeah, you don't want people
there's
accidentally transmitting it whether going in to receive the service. But yeah, it's a contrast to how the chiropractors are dealing with it for sure.
Speaking of offing things, Barbados is off the monarchy. That's a transition, Scott. That's how you do it.
But that, I think, goes in one of the top segues we've had so far.
Yeah, this week is the week that Barbados became an official republic. They had been moving in this direction for, I think, a year or two since the Labour Party there won all 30 seats in Parliament, which is quite the way to win an election. They needed to have a 2/3 majority in both houses. If you have all of them, you have all of them. So they didn't need to do a referendum, so it was actually quite a lot easier constitutionally than here in Canada. But they campaigned on removing the monarchy. They have now transitioned I believe it's their former Governor General into the role of president. So Barbados is actually being led by, I believe it's women as both prime minister and president. I don't know, I find this all fascinating and cool. And they've now handed it over. Although their Governor General is still, or their president is still a dame. So I guess they retain the titles.
Might as well. I mean, that's one of the better things about the constitutional monarchies. You just get cooler titles than you do in republics. So might as well hold on to that.
I did see that Angus Reid released a survey alongside this where a majority of Canadians in every form of the question they asked would be happy to see the monarchy end at some point in the generations to come. 52% think it should not continue versus only 25% think it should continue. This is down significantly from the last time they asked in January 2020 when 39% wanted to see it continue. Obviously, when they ask about monarchs not named Elizabeth II, support drops significantly.
And when they ask about specific monarchs or potential future monarchs, it seems to drop even more.
Yeah, no one likes Charles.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to replace Elizabeth for sure. But it's worth pointing out that it is a change in the constitutional setup in Canada. It's a lot more challenging. The monarchy is a unanimous consent provision for amending, so every province would have to agree to it, which would not happen.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the Bloc introduced a motion for unanimous consent to congratulate Barbados on dropping the monarchy in Parliament, and they did not get unanimous consent. In fact, Conservatives...
Shocker there.
I think it was Conservatives started singing "O Canada," but it might have been "God Save the Queen."
Why would you do...
But they got chastised for that in either case.
Yeah. I mean, God Save the Queen's the obvious one to do there.
It was a little petty, but it's not a bicycle behind you, which is a prop, and we're not talking about that. That's stupid. That story was dumb.
And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.